Good evening and welcome back. Settle in. Lower the lights if you'd like. There is nothing here you need to do tonight. Only listen and let the world grow quiet around you. Tonight we come to the last chapter of our long journey to the ends of the earth. The age of the lone explorer, hauling his sledge by the strength of his own body, was passing into history. In its place came the hum of engines and the drone of wings and the crackle of radios across the ice. We follow the men who flew over the poles and the ships that slipped beneath them. The explorer who wintered utterly alone in the dark, and the machines that at last drove clean across the frozen continent, while the great white wilderness, which had swallowed so many, gave up its secrets one by one. This is the story of how the poles were won. The great age of polar heroism ended, as so much else did, in the mud of the First World War. The men we have followed through these chapters: Franklin, lost with his ships in the Arctic; Scott, dead in his tent; Shackleton, who brought every one of his men home alive, belonged to a world that was vanishing. They had gone to the poles on foot and on skis, dragging their loads by muscle and by dog team, cut off from all the world for years at a time, with no way to call for help and no machine to carry them home. Theirs had been an age of the body and of endurance, and very often of death. And there is a quiet moment, easy to miss, where that age truly closes. In the first days of 1922, Ernest Shackleton went south one last time. He was older now and tired, and his great days were behind him, but the ice would not let him rest. He had gathered a little ship called the Quest, and a crew thick with old comrades from the Endurance, and a plan that was never quite settled: to circle the Antarctic coast, perhaps, and see what could be seen. The ship put in at South Georgia, at the old whaling station of Grytviken, the very harbour from which the Endurance had sailed, and to which Shackleton had staggered back, half dead, after the open boat journey that made him immortal. And there, in the night, his heart failed him. He was 47 years old. His men would have carried him home to England, but his wife, Emily, knowing him better than anyone, asked that he be buried where he lay, on South Georgia, at the gateway to the ice. And so he rests there still, among the whalers and the mountains facing south. Many mark that grave as the end of the heroic age. What came next arrived with engines. The aeroplane had grown, in the crucible of the war, from a flimsy novelty into a machine that could carry men and cargo across hundreds of miles of wilderness in a single afternoon, over country that would have cost a sledging party weeks of agony or their lives. The radio meant that an expedition need no longer vanish into total silence. Now a base on the ice could speak to the wider world and call for rescue and be found. And tracked vehicles, descended from the tanks of the Western Front, would one day haul loads that no team of dogs or ponies could ever move. The poles were still as cold and as deadly and as far away as they had always been, but the tools of reaching them had changed forever, and the men who took up those new tools would finish in a few short decades the work that the heroes had begun. The new age opened, fittingly, with the greatest of the old explorers learning to fly. Roald Amundsen, conqueror of the Northwest Passage, first man at the South Pole, had one great prize left on his list: the North Pole itself, which he had lost to Peary's claim while he was still a young man. By the 1920s, he had decided that the way to it lay through the air. And so, in the spring of 1925, at the age of 52, he took off from the islands of Svalbard with 5 companions in 2 flying boats and steered north over the frozen ocean toward a place where no aircraft had ever gone and where no rescue could ever come. They did not reach the pole. 150 miles short of it, with engines ailing, the 2 machines came down among the pressure ridges and open lids of the pack ice. 1 aircraft was damaged beyond saving. 6 men now stood on the drifting ice at the top of the world, with 1 flying boat between them and no runway. Nothing but jumbled, frozen chaos in every direction. What followed was one of the great quiet epics of the age. For more than 3 weeks, on short rations, the 6 men hacked and shoveled and stamped a runway out of the sea ice, moving hundreds of tons of snow and ice with hand tools and exhaustion, while the floes shifted and cracked beneath their work. Again and again, the ice broke their runway, and again they built it, and at last, with the season closing around them, all 6 crowded into the single remaining aircraft. She staggered into the air at the very end of the makeshift strip and carried them home, out of the white silence, to a world that had already given them up for dead. The following spring, the North Pole fell at last, and it fell twice in a single week. First came the Americans. In May of 1926, a naval officer named Richard Byrd, remember his name, for we will follow him for much of tonight, took off from Svalbard with his pilot, Floyd Bennett, in a 3-engined aeroplane named for the daughter of the man who paid for her. Some 15 hours later, they returned, and Byrd announced to the world that they had circled the North Pole. He flew home to parades and medals and fame. Yet a quiet doubt attached itself to that flight and never quite let go. The distances seemed long for the time elapsed. An oil leak had troubled one engine, and long after Byrd's death, scholars studying his diary found navigational readings erased and altered. Whether he truly reached the pole that day, no one now can say for certain. It is one more of the Arctic's unfinished stories, keeping company with Cook and Peary from 2 chapters ago. But 3 days later, there came a machine about which there is no doubt at all. She was called the Norge, an airship, a great silver whale of the sky, designed and piloted by an Italian engineer named Umberto Nobile. Aboard her rode Amundsen at the head of the expedition, and the American Lincoln Ellsworth, whose fortune had paid for her, and 13 others. She slipped her mast at Svalbard, droned out over the frozen ocean, and in the small hours of the 12th of May, 1926, she passed directly above the North Pole. Down through the cold air went 3 flags, Norwegian, American, Italian, fluttering onto the ice below. Then the Norge flew on, clean across the top of the world, over 1,000 miles of ice no human eye had ever seen, and came down at last in a tiny village on the coast of Alaska. It was the first crossing of the Arctic Ocean, and in the judgment of history, very likely the first time human beings ever truly reached the North Pole at all. If so, then Amundsen, who had already been first to the South Pole, was first at both ends of the Earth. No one else has ever matched it. Yet the age of machines exacted its own price, just as the age of muscle had. Amundsen and Nobile parted as enemies, quarrelling bitterly over the credit for the Norge's triumph. 2 years later, Nobile went north again with an airship of his own, the Italia, determined to prove what Italians could do without the old Norwegian. He reached the pole, and on the way home, in fog and wind, the Italia lost height and struck the pack ice. The control cabin was torn away, spilling 10 men onto the frozen sea. The lightened hull, with 6 men still aboard, rose again into the mist and drifted away and was never found. One of the men on the ice died of his injuries. The survivors, Nobel among them, his leg broken, huddled in the wreckage with a little tent they dyed red for the searchers, and a salvaged radio calling and calling into the static. For weeks the world held its breath. A dozen rescue expeditions from half a dozen nations pushed toward the red tent, by ship, by ski, by air. A Swedish pilot found them at last and landed on the ice and carried out the injured Nobel first. On the return trip, the rescuer crashed and became a castaway himself. In the end, it was the Soviet icebreaker, grinding through the pack, that reached the last of the survivors. 8 of the Italia's men never came home, and 2 of the rescuers died as well, searching a frozen ocean for strangers. One of those rescuers was Amundsen. He was 55 years old, retired, and still nursing his grievance against Nobel. It made no difference. When word came that the Italia was down, the old explorer borrowed a French flying boat, gathered a crew, and took off from northern Norway across the Barents Sea, into weather he knew better than any man alive. Somewhere over that cold grey water, the aircraft went down. A float and a fuel tank washed ashore months later. Nothing else was ever found. And so, the man who'd mastered both ends of the earth, who had spent his whole life outwitting the ice, vanished into it at last, on an errand of mercy, flying to the aid of a rival he had never forgiven. The Arctic kept him as it had kept Franklin, and it has never given him back. While the Arctic was taking its toll, the far south lay quiet. No expedition had wintered on the Antarctic continent since Shackleton's day. It was Richard Byrd, the same Byrd of the disputed Northern Flight, who carried the machine age south. Whatever the truth of his North Pole claim, Byrd was a formidable organiser, with a gift for raising money and headlines in equal measure. In 1928, he sailed for the Ross Ice Shelf, with ships, aircraft, radio masts, and nearly 100 men, and built on the ice the largest base the Antarctic had ever seen. A half-buried village of huts and hangars and humming generators that he named, with a showman's touch, Little America. And in the late November of 1929, Byrd attempted something no one had ever done. He set out to fly to the South Pole and back. 4 men went, Byrd navigating, the great Norwegian-born pilot Bernt Balken at the controls, a co-pilot and a photographer. The hardest moment came when the land itself stood in their way. The trans-antarctic mountains, a wall of rock and ice between the ice shelf and the high polar plateau. The heavily loaded aircraft could not climb fast enough in the thin air. As the glacier pass rose toward them, they began to throw their supplies overboard. Sack after sack of emergency food, meant to keep them alive if they crashed, tumbling away into the snow, gambling their lives on the engine's holding. Lightened, the machine clawed her way up and over the pass with little to spare, droned on across the white tableland and passed above the South Pole. The place that had cost Scott and his 4 companions their lives, 18 years before, was crossed now in a matter of hours, and seen from the warmth of a cockpit. They were back at Little America in less than a day, the round trip complete. The pole had been reached by wing, and no one would stand upon it again by any means at all, for another 27 years. Not every story of the machine age was one of speed and engines. There was one in particular that turned inward, into the silence and the dark and a single human mind. In the winter of 1934, on his second great expedition, Richard Byrd did a thing that no one had asked of him, and that he very nearly did not survive. He chose to man a small weather station, alone, far out on the Ross ice shelf, through the whole of the polar night. A single tiny hut, buried beneath the snow, 120 miles from the nearest other soul. One man, his instruments, his books, and the endless darkness pressing in. He had wanted the solitude. He had wanted, he later wrote, to know what it was to be truly alone and to taste a piece of it. For a time, he found exactly that. A deep and ringing quiet, the auroras folding and unfolding overhead, a stillness unlike anything in the ordinary world. He kept his weather readings, wound his clocks, took his walks in the blackness with the stars for company, and felt for a few weeks that he had found something close to perfect peace. And then the hut began to kill him. The stove that warmed him and the little generator that powered his radio were leaking carbon monoxide into the buried room, an odourless, tasteless poison building slowly in the sealed air. Day by day it worked at him. His strength drained away, his mind clouded. He grew too weak to crank the radio properly, too weak at times to leave his bunk, lying in the dark and the cold, forcing himself to eat, fighting simply to keep breathing and to keep his thoughts in order long enough to live another day. He understood with a terrible clarity what was happening to him, and he understood something else, that if he told the men at Little America the truth, they would come for him. Through the winter night, across 100 miles of crevassed ice, in temperatures that could kill a stranded party in hours. He believed the rescue would cost more lives than his own, so he said nothing, tapping out his cheerful little messages with hands that would barely obey him. But his comrades sensed it anyway. The messages came slower and stranger and full of small mistakes. And at last, in the bitter heart of the winter, 3 men set out from Little America in a track machine, feeling their way south through the darkness by flag and by compass, the cold splitting their instruments, turning back twice before the ice let them through. When they reached the buried hut, a gaunt figure climbed up out of the snow to meet them, hollow-cheeked, unsteady, weeks from death, and said simply that he was glad to see them. They stayed with him 2 months, nursing him until the sun returned and a plane could carry him home. Byrd lived another 23 years, and out of those long weeks alone came a quiet, haunting book. He called it simply Alone, about what it is to face the dark and the silence and one's own death with nothing and no one to lean on. Of all the tales of the machine age, it is the oldest kind of story after all. One man against the ice and against the failing of his own body. The Second World War swept the explorers from the ice as the first had before it. When they returned in strength, whole fleets and air wings now, mapping the coasts of Antarctica by radar and camera, building stations, wintering by the dozen. The machines had won. What remained were the last great journeys, and the greatest of them was the one that had broken Shackleton. No one had ever crossed Antarctica. No one had travelled overland from one coast across the pole to the other. The very dream for which the Endurance had sailed in 1914 and been crushed and taken the dream down with her. In 1955, a British-led expedition set out to finish it at last, and to finish it with machines. Its leader was a quiet, methodical scientist named Fuchs, and his plan echoed Shackleton's own 40 years on. Fuchs and the crossing party would start from the Weddell Sea, Shackleton's old fatal coast, drive inland to the pole and carry on down the far side. And from the opposite shore, a second party would climb up from the Ross Sea, laying depots of fuel and food along the final stretch of the route, so the crossing party could resupply and roll onto the coast. Leading that second party was the most famous adventurer alive, Edmund Hillary of New Zealand, who only 4 years earlier had stood first on the summit of Everest. Fuchs drove for the pole in a column of tracked snow vehicles, orange and growling, hauling sledges of fuel across a landscape that had killed every earlier generation to challenge it. The dangers had not softened. Again and again, the crevasses opened under the machines, a vehicle lurching nose down into a blue-lit chasm, saved by its tow lines, winched back inch by inch onto solid ice. The party stopped too, every few miles, to set off small charges and listen to the echoes, measuring for the first time the staggering depth of the ice beneath their tracks. They were crossing the continent and sounding it as they went. Explorers and scientists in the same breath. Hillary, meanwhile, was climbing toward the plateau from the far side with a small team and a line of modest farm tractors, fitted with tracks, sturdy little machines never meant for the ends of the earth. He laid his depots, one after another, further and further inland, and then, with the depots down and the road ahead open, he found he could not resist. Pressing on past his orders, he drove his tractors up the last few hundred miles of the plateau, and on the 4th of January 1958 rolled to a stop at the South Pole itself. His were the first vehicles ever to reach it, and his the first party to stand there overland since Scott's 546 years before. Scott's men had arrived starving, frostbitten and beaten. Hillary arrived on a tractor, low on fuel, and asked more or less what there was for tea. 2 weeks later, Fuchs's column came grinding in from the Weddell side, and the two parties met at the bottom of the world, at the new American station that now stood upon the pole. Then Fuchs pushed on, down Hillary's depot line, through the worst of the summer blizzards, and in early March 1958, 99 days and over 2,000 miles from his starting point, he rolled onto the far coast at last. Antarctica had been crossed from sea to sea, through the pole, the first time in human history. The journey that had broken Shackleton, and that he never even began, was complete. And it had taken everything: track machines and aircraft, radios and depots, and the accumulated wisdom of every expedition that had come before. The age of the machine had finished the work of the age of the heroes. By then, at the other end of the earth, the last mysteries of the North were falling too, to a machine that travelled where no explorer had ever gone, under the ice. The idea was older than it seems. Back in 1931, an Australian explorer named Hubert Wilkins, a pioneer of polar flight and one of the boldest minds of the age, had taken a worn-out submarine, renamed her Nautilus, and tried to sail her beneath the Arctic pack toward the pole. The old boat broke down and the attempt collapsed, and the world had a gentle laugh at his expense. But Wilkins had seen the future clearly. he was simply 30 years early. In the summer of 1958, a new Nautilus, the first nuclear-powered submarine ever built, needing no air and no fuel from the surface, slid quietly beneath the ice north of Alaska. For 4 days, she ran deep beneath the frozen ocean, under ice that had defeated ships for 4 centuries. And on the 3rd of August 1958, she passed directly beneath the North Pole and carried on and came out the other side of the Arctic Ocean entirely. The Northwest Passage's old dream, a shortcut across the top of the world, had come true at last, 100 feet under the ice that had killed Franklin and his men. The following spring, her sister ship, the Skate, did something gentler and stranger and altogether more moving. She rose through the frozen sea itself, breaking up through the ice to surface at the North Pole, the first vessel in history to lie still at the very top of the world, and her crew climbed out onto the ice, into the wind, and held a small ceremony, for they had brought with them the ashes of Hubert Wilkins, dead just a few months before. There, at the pole he had tried to reach in his broken-down submarine a generation too soon, they scattered him into the polar wind. The vision had outlived the man, as in the end, the great visions always do. And something deeper had changed at the ends of the earth. Quietly, almost without anyone noticing. The poles had always been places of rivalry, one nation racing another, one man racing another for flags and glory and grief. But in the late 1950s, the nations of the world tried something new. They declared a great shared year of science, the International Geophysical Year, in which dozens of countries would study the whole Earth together, its oceans, its skies, its magnetism, its ice. And the frozen continent of Antarctica became its centerpiece. 12 nations built research stations all across the ice, coastal bases and high plateau outposts, Soviet and American, British and Japanese, side by side in the coldest place on Earth, while their governments glared at each other across the rest of the world. One of those stations was built in the most fitting place imaginable, directly upon the South Pole itself. Aircraft landed on the polar snow. Engineers and dog teams laid out a base where no human being had ever spent a night, and men moved in and lit the lamps and stayed the whole black winter through, a permanent home, warm and lit, standing year-round on the spot that had cost so many so much. And they gave it a name that closed an old wound. They called it the Amundsen-Scott Station, honouring together at last the two rivals who had raced each other to that point, the victor and the lost, their names joined forever above the bottom of the world. And the nations went further still. In Washington, in December of 1959, the 12 countries of the Antarctic signed a treaty unlike any the world had seen. The whole continent, a landmass larger than Europe, was set aside for all time as a place of peace and science. No armies, no weapons, no borders, and no nation seizing it for its own. Every station open to inspection by every other. The most hostile wilderness on Earth, which men had fought and died merely to touch, became the one place on the planet dedicated wholly to knowledge and shared by all. That treaty holds to this day. It is perhaps the finest monument the explorers ever received. So, our long journey ends in a quiet that Franklin, lost in his ship, could never have imagined. Today, aircraft land at the South Pole on the open snow. Men and women live there through the winter night, in warmth and safety, and speak to their families on the far side of the world, and watch the same auroras wheel overhead that Byrd watched alone and failing from his buried hut. Submarines pass beneath the North Pole in the dark, and the old sea lanes of the Northwest Passage carry quiet summer traffic past the graves on Beachy Island. The wilderness that killed Franklin and Scott and so many whose names we never knew has been mapped and crossed and settled, and yet it is not tamed. Step outside the warm stations, beyond the lights and the engines, and the ice is exactly what it always was, vast and silent and indifferent. The wind blowing across the plateau as it blew over Amundsen's flag and Scott's frozen tent, and over the slow drifting sea where Franklin's ships kept their long watch in the dark. The explorers are gone now, the maps are filled in, but the great white silence remains at the top and the bottom of the world, waiting, as it has always waited, beneath the turning stars. That is where we will leave it tonight, and where we will leave them all, the lost and the saved, and the ones who came home. Thank you for wandering through these 5 stories with me to the very ends of the earth. Sleep well wherever you are, and when you're ready, we'll go wandering again.